An introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Mitch. Shadow regulation is not a term that existed before we came up with it, but we thought that we needed a term to describe what we saw as a pattern of shadowy agreements that have the effect of regulating the internet. So I'm going to give you a bit of a definition of what we have described as shadow regulation and why we think it's a problem, and then describe the project that EFF has started just this year in the past couple of months to address what we see as this problem. So here's the outline of the presentation. I'm going to begin by talking about what is shadow regulation. So we describe shadow regulation as the misuse of closed and opaque voluntary agreements to regulate internet content. It doesn't just take place to regulate one sort of content, it takes place across all of these areas: intellectual property, quote unquote hate speech, terrorism, child online protection, and others. And these agreements may go by different words. They're not always known as agreements. You might come across them as codes, principles, standards, memoranda of understanding.
Even best practices.
Best practices, indeed. Like what they have in common, though, is that they are not just one party. So it's not just, for example, Facebook by itself setting policies. That's a different situation. It's not just the government making laws, but it's where these two come together in a way that is outside of the normal legislative process. So it's not a lawmaking process. It's a process of agreement between industry and sometimes with the involvement of government. And there are some good things about that. It's not entirely bad. So voluntary agreements are actually what the internet is largely based on. So we've heard about ISOC's role in internet standards development. And standards are really just a form of voluntary agreement between internet users about how the internet should work. And making those sorts of agreements can be more flexible, faster, and cheaper than regulation. You wouldn't want the government to be setting rules about how the internet should work in many cases because they would get it wrong, they don't understand the technology. So it can be good to have voluntary agreements. And the other advantage that these can have is that they can work across borders. The internet, of course, is a borderless space where there aren't checkpoints between countries in general, unlike laws, which have to work on a country-by-country basis. So these cross-border agreements can be an effective way of dealing with the fact that we have almost 200 countries in the world and only one internet. But there are also some bad things about the misuse of voluntary agreements, particularly in cases where, for example, governments may use them to abdicate their responsibilities to their citizens by regulating the internet on the sly, by going to companies and saying, we want you to kind of pass this censorship or make this censorship practice without us having to make it into a law. Because if we make it into a law, people are going to protest on the streets, it's going to be a real drag. Why don't you just do it? So that can sometimes happen.
In that context, I'll add another term that sometimes gets used for that is policy laundering.
Indeed. And that's another one we're going to come across later in this slide deck, because it's where the government wants to be able to wash their hands of it and saying, oh, well, it's not us, it's the industry that did this. But often the government will be behind the scenes pushing the industry into that direction. We also find that the industry can use these agreements to self-regulate in a way that isn't accountable and transparent. So it really takes users out of the picture and can result in agreements that don't reflect the broader interests of users who are affected by those rules. And in general, there can be a lack of transparency, accountability, and user participation in these agreements. So our project has a positive and a critical agenda. We're not just saying that all shadow regulation or all voluntary agreements are bad, but we're calling out the bad ones. We're saying whenever there is a code, memorandum of understanding, standard, etc., that lacks transparency and participation and bypasses democratic processes, we're calling that out as an example of shadow regulation. And we have a series of blog posts where we're giving examples of this and explaining why this is not an appropriate way to regulate the internet. On the other hand, we also have a positive agenda to this program, which tries to point people in the direction of better voluntary agreements, how they can do things right. So if you do want to address a problem online, and the best way to do that is through agreement between different parties, you should do it in a way that's inclusive, balanced, and accountable. And I'll explain some more about the criteria that are in our positive agenda in the next few slides. But I'm going to pass over to Mitch now, who's going to give some examples of bad cases of shadow regulation. So there you go, Mitch.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so these are the ones we've seen lately, and we've been writing about some of these, and more still to come. But actually going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these afterwards, time permitting. But the sort of things that we've seen that are the current examples of shadow regulation. Some of them these are happening in the domain name system, the DNS context, and either in ICANN or kind of on the periphery of the ICANN processes. And there I'm referring to something called the Healthy Domains Initiative, and related to that, a couple of agreements between the Motion Picture Association of America and a couple of large domain name registries, which are agreements to enforce copyright through the threat of domain name suspension. There's no legal requirement to do this. Certainly not in the U.S. and not in any other country that I'm aware of. There's no proactive legal requirement to do this, but the notion is that a sort of particular well-connected group of rights claimants, in this case the Motion Picture Association of America, which is the 6 major movie studios, will have a privileged position with some infrastructure owner, in this case a domain name registry. Donuts owns about 200 new top-level domains, I think, including .movie and .theater, but also many others. And they basically agreed to accept and take seriously, really, tacitly, it's accept and act on accusations of copyright infringement against particular websites. They claim that in their first 9 months they claim they've received 12 complaints and suspended domains in some portion of those and rejected a few of them. But there's no court process here. There's no arbitration. This is essentially judge, jury, and executioner of a website, all happening privately. And this Healthy Domains Initiative is there's some which is a project of a number of domain name registrars and registries. Again, Donuts is involved. Where it looks like they're trying to set this up as a best practice and then present it as something that everyone should do. So and then Jeremy was talking about the difference between an individual company's policies and a sort of a collective non-governmental policy. It looks like this is an effort to turn this into a collective non-governmental policy with either a sort of a formal or a soft agreement between and among domain name companies, with sort of advocates of sort of particular interests in content, whether that's copyright or pharmaceutical or various law enforcement interests. But looks like a push to make that a norm. Pharmacies is sort of the other current one, and this is happening mainly between this organization called LegitScript in the U.S. and a number of domain name companies, where they've basically agreed to on accusation demand pharmacy licenses from websites that are purporting to sell pharmaceuticals, and then shut them down if they can't produce a valid license. Now, there's obviously some really important and dire concerns going on here, and we're talking about counterfeit pharmaceuticals, or tainted pharmaceuticals, or things that present a real health hazard. But this is, again, it's extra legal, it's extra judicial. There's no court process, and this privately the domain name companies and this industry organization are judge, jury, and executioner. So, no matter the goal, we think this sets a bad precedent.
Any government agency such as the FDA had any input on this or connected to this issue?
Not officially. No, yeah.
So
In other words,
this
not
is
formally.
like the abdication of responsibility you're talking about?
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, the head of LegitScript used to work for the FDA in some capacity, so there's definitely links there. But as Mitch said, it's you have to really read behind the corporate documents to find out where the connections go.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, Mitch, can you actually, if somebody asks you a question, can you repeat the question so the
I will. Yeah.
stream that can
Yeah.
ask the question?
Yeah. Sure. Some of these, actually, Jeremy can say more about these, but they're largely they're initiatives of the European Commission, but they're not. Now, certainly they have directives which get incorporated into national law and the EU members, but this is not that. This is, we'd really like it if internet intermediaries, quote unquote, voluntarily adopted these various practices. One of them was about hate speech. Which is poorly defined concept, and I think so is a concept that's troubling to a lot of free speech advocates, because it's easily co-opted. Again, we're talking about legitimate concerns here, and this is not to dismiss them. Obviously, this is talking about this gets into recruitment into terrorist groups, or inciting violence, and that kind of thing. But rather than have a government process, an open process for to both come up with the criteria and then enforce them, this is it's an abdication of responsibility to simply sort of pressure platforms like Facebook into coming up with a policy and enforcing it, and then government washes its hands. That's the sort of the concern that we're seeing, and the same thing with this office which is part of the White House called the U.S. IP Enforcement Coordinator. Increasingly doing a lot of this, the same sort of thing. Basically, the U.S. government encourages and champions private voluntary agreements. Well, anytime a government makes a statement like that, there's an implied threat to it. There's if not a threat, a bit of coerciveness to it, because it's implicitly backed by the awesome power of the state. So when the government comes knocking and says, I really think you should do this, it's natural to think I should do this to avoid future regulation, or I should do this to gain future business with the government, or what have you. But it makes it a bit of a misnomer to call these things voluntary at that point. The other ones is a copyright alert system. This was also known as the Six Strikes Agreement, which was implemented in the U.S. There are similar ones in other countries. Again, a private agreement, in this case between consumer internet service providers and copyright and trademark holders, to again, suspend accounts on demand, or if not suspend, in the U.S. it's not suspension, it's sort of warnings and potential slowdowns or temporary interruptions of service. Similar ones with payment processors, credit card networks, and so on, and with advertising networks. Theirs is looser. That's this IACC Market Safe and Roadblock. That's the advertising one, right, Jeremy?
Trustworthy ad guidelines too.
Trustworthy ad guidelines. Yeah. These are they're looser. They're more. Here's a set of principles that we all agree on, and we all think we should do this, but we're not going to coordinate action. In a sense, that's that's less dangerous because they're not marching in the same direction. They're not agreeing on a common set of rules or criteria. It's also, again, less accountable.
Is there a reason that you didn't include Operation Choke Point in this, or are you gonna get to that later? Or?
I'm not sure what that refers
Operation
to. Yeah.
Choke Point was.
Yeah, you're asking about Operation Choke Point, which I haven't heard of.
Yeah, Operation Choke Point was an action that the U.S. government took where they couldn't come in and force certain businesses to stop operation, but what they did is they attacked the financial rails to those businesses. So they pressured Visa and MasterCard to essentially financially exclude those businesses because they couldn't pass laws to target them, and so they basically leaned on financial rails to erase them.
So to repeat that for the folks listening remotely, you were saying that it was an effort by the U.S. government where they didn't have formal sort of law enforcement complaints against a business. They pressured payment providers or networks to cut off these companies' ability to process payments. Yeah, that's almost broader. I mean, that could go beyond the internet, but yeah, that's absolute. That's very similar to what we're talking about here.
So it might be worth mentioning that LegitScript also, apart from doing deals with domain registries or registrars to block domains, it also has arrangements with the payment processors. So Visa and MasterCard and PayPal all use LegitScript's database of websites to decide which ones are allowed to process payments through their networks and which ones aren't.
So you mentioned that was called Project Choke Point. I mean, one of the things we call that and some of these other things is free speech weak links. We've listed a bunch of them on this chart, which is one of the outputs of our project here. All for all the decentralized nature of the internet, it has these various choke points, all of which, in a sense, attract would-be censors, with or without accountability. Your web host, your certificate authority, the upstream connectivity provider, your CDN search engine, the DNS system, your internet, the internet service provider on the far end, and then sort of off here on a different chain, content platforms, user-generated content platforms, et cetera, and payment processors. So yeah, these are all potential choke points and thus potential places for shadow regulation. I'm going to pass this back to Jeremy because this is getting back to our positive agenda. These are all the things we're worried about. The positive agenda here is how to do these things better. And I'll just say this sort of thing often is what's commonly called multi-stakeholder process. In other words, the existing, in many cases necessary forms of non-governmental coordination and organization are done through multi-stakeholder processes, ICANN, IETF, IGF, so on and so forth. The problem is the word multi-stakeholder has been kind of been drained of meaning, so we're taking a fresh look, and this is our attempt to do that.
Thanks very much, Mitch.
Yeah.
I'm going to hand back to Mitch a bit later to talk about his experiences recently at the ICANN meeting, which he's just returned from in Hyderabad, where he presented our shadow regulation proposals. But meanwhile, this is a document that we came up with, and there are some copies of it here on the desk, so please take one afterwards. We wanted to distill down the ideas of how we could create better voluntary agreements without just saying, oh, they need to be multi-stakeholder, because if, as Mitch said, that's kind of meaningless in a lot of ways. So many things that are actually not particularly inclusive are just labeled with this word multi-stakeholderism, and we're supposed to accept that as being okay. But often it's kind of a smokescreen. So we wanted to break that down and say, what do we really mean? What do we really want to see? And we've simplified it, of course. It's just a one-pager, so there's a lot more depth to it than what we could fit in here. But these are the essential points. And rather than trying to read out this small text to you, I've got the same information on some of the slides that follow. So but back to multi-stakeholderism. So ICANN is an example of one body that tries to structure itself in a way that all of these stakeholder groups get to have a say in the policies that it makes. We've got the global top-level domain registries, registrars, the intellectual property interests, the ISPs, businesses, non-commercial interests, not-for-profit, NGOs who own domain names, and they all have some measure of representation within ICANN structure. So this is one way of doing multi-stakeholder policy development, where you kind of hard code the interests of the affected stakeholders into the organizational structure. That's not the only way of doing it. It's not necessarily the best way of doing it. It can still be captured. ICANN, many people would say, has been unduly influenced by certain sectors, such as the IP interests. So we've kind of thrown that out and gone back to the drawing board. Here are some other examples of multi-stakeholder processes that are done differently to ICANN. So we're not saying ICANN is wrong, we're just saying there are other ways of doing it which may be better suited to particular types of agreements. So the Marco Civil da Internet was a Brazilian agreement that turned into a piece of legislation. It's basically a Bill of Rights for the Internet in Brazil. And they started off by putting it online for people to comment on. And people produced a whole set of improvements to the draft, and that went back to the government to turn it into a piece of legislation. So it's really multi-stakeholder law in a way, where users had direct input into writing it, but at the end of the day it was the government that signed off on it. So just because something is multi-stakeholder doesn't mean that it doesn't have the government's sign-off at the end of the day. In this case it did. In other cases it may not. Another example that's similar to the Marco Civil is the Magna Carta for Philippine Internet Freedom, which was also produced in a similar sort of process, where users were able to comment in an online platform, and this fed into the development of an instrument. Another one that's a little bit like that but didn't turn into a formal law is the Net Mundial Declaration. This was a non-binding soft law declaration. ISOC was involved in the production of this. EFF was there. Industry groups, non-profits, governments from all around the world came to India, and each of them had a committee or representation on a committee where they had an equal say in the development of this document. So governments were not in control. They had an equal, I think there were 3 or 4 microphones in the plenary discussion room that came up with the Net Mundial Declaration, and the governments had exactly the same speaking time as civil society and exactly the same speaking time as the private sector, and there was, I think, also the technical and academic communities. There were also online working groups that ended up creating a document that was not perfect, but it was relatively better. The process was more open than we typically see in shadow regulation. So these are, I don't think there's ever been a perfect multi-stakeholder process though. So these are the kind of criteria that we think should always be reflected in an agreement that's reached between internet stakeholders. Firstly, everyone who is affected by the proposed rules ought to be able to have a say. So that means inclusion. Balance means that you need to make sure that one particular stakeholder doesn't overpower the others because of its power, its money, or its influence. We need to make sure that the best ideas rise to the top rather than just the ideas of the most powerful. And there needs to be accountability between the body that's generating this document, recommendation, agreement, whatever it is, and the stakeholders. They need to be mutually accountable for each other. And then at the beginning and end of these criteria, firstly, we have to decide, is this a problem that needs a coordinated agreement at all? Maybe we don't even need to have a coordinated agreement. Maybe we can just rely on empowering users to solve this problem. Or maybe we can rely on the local level rather than having a global agreement that may not be applicable in every place where it needs to be applied. So that
So on hate speech, for example, empowering individual internet users to use personal filters, may be an alternative to trying to filter or ban hate speech, at a network level.
So we consider that first of all before we even get to this. Then these are the criteria if we decide we do want to have some kind of a coordination. And then at the end we should work out what do we want to do with the recommendation or the agreement that we've come up with. Is it going to be something that is directly enforced like the way that ICANN directly enforces its domain name rules? Or is it just going to be a recommendation that feeds into a government process like what happened with the Marco Civil? So this is just a really high-level overview. And I've got a few, I maybe don't want to spend too much longer on the details. But I've got 3 more slides which are slightly more detailed, and then if you're really interested, I've got a paper which is like 20 pages, which is even more detailed. But inclusion includes not only just allowing people in the door, it also means resourcing them to participate, because oftentimes the users, the civil society groups, have the least resources and they can't afford to fly to Washington to be in meetings, and take time out of their day to do this stuff. So it can mean resourcing them with travel funding, with sometimes bursaries or whatever they need to actually effectively engage in a process. And I'll skip over some of these other points, but that's a key one. Next, in terms of balancing the power of the stakeholders, again, I won't go through all of these, but one thing I will say is the way that ICANN does things by structuring itself in a predetermined way that's meant to reflect the interests of stakeholders, that's only one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is the net mondial approach, where you don't try and, or the IGF's approach, which is really less tightly structured in terms of the way the organization looks, and it's more just about letting people debate, and we can use techniques of deliberative democracy to foster informed discussion that helps produce solutions that are in the mutual self-interest of all of the stakeholders. That's a lecture in itself, but then accountability. As I said, this doesn't just mean that the organization needs to be accountable, so that's important, yes. Organizations like, I don't want to keep on going back to ICANN, but they need to have mechanisms of review and appeal and transparency of their processes, but also the participants need to be accountable as well. That means you want to make sure that there aren't fake NGOs that are really just governments in disguise, or there are not just what are the fake grassroots organizations called?
AstroTurf.
AstroTurf, that's the word. AstroTurf organizations that are really industry in disguise. So there needs to be some accountability on both sides. Accountability from the stakeholders, as well as accountability to the stakeholders. So there's lots more I could say, but I'm going to hand back over, I'm going to skip this as well. I'm going to hand back over to Mitch to talk some more about what he has been doing over the past week at ICANN. So if we can switch to Mitch's slide deck, that would be great. Thanks.
So this is, so I was at the, what was it, ICANN 57 meeting in Hyderabad, India last week. We're trying to put some of these principles into practice, and so this touches on shadow regulation, but in this really specific area, which was ICANN's relationship to the regulation of web content. And there's forces pulling in both directions, let me say, there at ICANN. So I think this is just a kind of an illustration of one of our concerns. Now these are the new bylaws. These are the ICANN bylaws implemented this year as part of the transition away from U.S. government oversight, which is now complete. And this part here, I see as a very sort of strong statement of principle. It says, ICANN shall not regulate, i.e. impose rules and restrictions on services that use the Internet's unique identifiers or the content that such services carry or provide. So this is drawing the line between domain names, which are the purview of that organization, and services and content pointed to by those domain names. That's internet content. And it's saying ICANN just doesn't control content. So that that's a strong and kind of broad statement. But then just after that, and here you see where the organization's getting sort of pulled in both directions. We see, no, right after that in the bylaws, we see this, and I didn't even include it all here, but essentially it takes that statement, we don't regulate content, and it pokes all kinds of holes in it. It says, notwithstanding the rest of the bylaws, including that sort of strong statement about content regulation, what it goes on to say is it grandfathers in all the existing agreements with domain registrars and registries. That those can never be challenged as outside of ICANN's mission. What's in those? This is an example of it right here. This is the sort of master agreement for domain name registrars that was put in place in 2013. Defines illegal activity to be conduct prohibited by applicable law in furtherance of conduct involving the use of a registered name. So there's some ambiguity here now if we think about this. And then here's where the definition comes into play. Now, registrar shall take reasonable and prompt steps to investigate and respond appropriately to any response of abuse, where abuse is defined as conduct involving the use of a registered name. Now, what does that mean? Is that registering a name that's confusingly similar to someone's trademark, or is that illegal content within the content of a website? Right. There's an ambiguity here as to whether this agreement applies to web content. And since these agreements cannot be challenged as outside, the existing ones can't be challenged as outside ICANN's mandate, then it kind of comes down to who's interpreting this as to whether this allows content regulation or not. And certain ICANN participants will tell you this absolutely does, specifically copyright enforcement or the pharmacy enforcement that I mentioned. And some people would say use of a registered name means the name itself. This is again, and ICANN really is being pulled in both of these directions by its various stakeholders. There's, I think, a strong commitment there among engineers, and especially among really kind of the leadership, some of whom were really kind of the founding engineers of the internet. That this principle is important. But the multi-stakeholder process, is kind of leading us in various instances to this. Yeah, I see a question.
Illegal in which jurisdiction?
Yeah, you said you're asking illegal in which jurisdiction, and that's an excellent question, right? Because laws are not the same everywhere. Even copyright law, which is somewhat uniform because most countries are parties to the Berne Convention on Artistic Works, which is sort of the global framework for copyright. But even within that, the laws vary a lot, especially the exceptions to those laws. So yeah, things are illegal in some places and not in others, and it's not at all clear whose law should apply and whose law should be enforced. Yeah. So again, here the folks, we sort of mentioned this before, but the folks who are in there right now asking to breach that wall. The media and entertainment industries, pharmaceutical interests. This has come up in some of the particular new top-level domain names. This happened with .doctor, although I believe it was rejected there. Some of the people involved wanted this top-level domain limited to licensed medical doctors, leaving out many other professionals who might use the title of doctor. There was another one which I'm forgetting right now, but there was a few of this sort, But again, matter of degree, right? Maybe probably not that many people will use .doctor. A lot of people are already using .org. So if you apply policies to .org, it's a lot closer to a global regulation than to one of these new top-level domains that's not widely used. And it was some push to, mainly from various law enforcement agencies towards using, again, the threat of domain name suspension to enforce rules about fraudulent web content, which, again, is susceptible to many meanings and much variation between countries. Where do we go from here, right? The concern is, for us, is that once you've built these structures, whether through ICANN or through agreements outside of it, for these things, and sure, maybe I think on some level these are all important, right? But certainly tainted drugs, stopping the flow of unlicensed pharmaceuticals, tainted pharmaceuticals, various law enforcement interests, copyright enforcement on some level. These are valid. But once you build the infrastructures for essentially terminate domains on demand with some level or not of process involved, then there's a temptation to use this for other things. So this is, I'm not going to repeat these because we've sort of mentioned them before. I know Public Interest Registry, which is the registry that owns .org at this, but that manages the .org top-level domain, is looking to do an arbitration process based on the existing arbitration process for names themselves, but applied to content and specifically to copyright enforcement. My fear there, even though the positive part of that is that they're proposing to use neutral arbitrators. The fear of that is that getting overloaded. So if we're doing that for copyright, why not for blasphemy laws or hate speech laws or the law in various countries have laws against insulting the king or the president. Russia has a law about content that promotes homosexual lifestyles. Some of these start to get problematic pretty fast, and when you build these systems, they're going to tend to be used and overloaded for those things. That's the fear. Let me see. I mean, these are the challenges that this raises, and I mentioned the third one here already. There's again, Jeremy. This is how Jeremy started this off. We were talking about the distinction. What we're calling shadow regulation is collective regulation, whether by hard agreement or soft agreement among businesses, or businesses kind of marching in the same direction with the tacit or sort of encouragement or pressure of governments, but without democratic accountability or sort of multi-stakeholder accountability. But we want to distinguish that from individual conduct. These are all private businesses for the most part. Some of them are NGOs and governments, but they can all set the terms on which they themselves will do business. And of course, some of that is going to naturally be uniform, but that's where this distinction gets tricky. But if I'm a domain registrar and I don't want to do business with white nationalists or with violent extremist groups, that's my prerogative. Where some coordination, with some coordinated body that covering all or most of the domain name space or the internet space is deciding on those policies and implementing them, that starts to look a lot like law, and that to us is where the problem is. I think I'll leave it there because this is some of this is a bit redundant, but we're happy to answer questions, and that's sort of our take on where we're at.
Are you guys aware at all about Namecoin and 1Bit? Their efforts to create a decentralized DNS, so we avoid some of these problems. Any kind of thoughts about that, or?
I think if we had invented the domain name system all over again today, we would do it differently, and we would have learned a few things from the more decentralized technologies like blockchain that we have. But again, it's a case of there are so many internet technologies we could do better now, but it's just hard to move from what we have. Look at IPv4 moving to IPv6. So, I've seen Namecoin, but the chances of it making a lot of inroads, I'm not so sure.
My question that I tend to raise, we were talking about blockchain technologies, is what problem are you trying to solve? Using Namecoin or using a blockchain, to manage unique identifiers, you may solve some problems of ongoing administration and of capture, but it doesn't automatically help you set the initial policies. You still need a human process to set what the rules are going to be, what the initial policies are going to be, and it also makes those policies harder to change going forward, which is maybe what you want, but maybe not. Yes.
Could you talk about the sort of recent trends in all of what you're speaking of, and also your prognosis of the next 6 months to a year? Where are we trending on this? Are we getting more towards what you guys are looking for in the green, or are we moving more in the direction of the red? And what can we all do to push it toward the green?
Do you want to take that?
Sure. I think we're moving in both. Yeah. He asked, what's the prognosis for the coming months, and is the world moving more towards shadow regulation or more towards sort of good accountability and accountability and transparency? I actually think we're moving in both directions simultaneously. There are two. This is happening along a number of dimensions. It's happening within all of those choke points that were in our chart. And some of those are better places to do it than others, and some of them are doing it better than others. So not a very satisfying answer, but we've so I'll tell you this. 4.5 years ago, there was an attempt in the U.S. to legislate DNS termination or IP level blocking on demand with minimal process based on accusations of IP infringement, and that was rejected after some massive protests, and it hasn't come back. But the interests who wanted that world didn't stop there. What they did was move to these less accountable fora. They started trying to do this through private agreements, through so-called voluntary agreements, and elements in the government. Again, this is U.S., but I know that there are similar examples in Europe that I'm less familiar with. The goal hasn't changed, but they're doing it through shadow regulation precisely because there's less democratic accountability.
I can maybe talk a bit about Europe. So recently, actually right now in Europe, there's a proposal to require internet platforms to filter everything that you upload for copyright infringements. Not just videos, like that already happens on YouTube. When you upload something to YouTube, there'll be a filter in the background, and if it notices that it's the same as something in its copyright database, then it'll either monetize that or it'll inform the rights holder and give them a chance to take it down. But in Europe, they're proposing to require all platforms to do this, not just video sharing, not just music, but maybe even photos and possibly text user content platforms, to have this kind of filtering. But they're not doing it as a government mandate directly. They're saying you have to engage in good faith negotiations with rights holders and reach a voluntary agreement. I mean, they don't use that word, but it's basically a con. They're saying this is not regulation, this is you entering into a voluntary agreement. Yeah, but of course they're entering into voluntary agreements because the law says they have to negotiate with rights holders and come up with an agreement. So this is something that Europe is definitely trending towards. And the other example that was on our slide was the hate speech code of conduct, where the European Commission went to the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Microsoft, and said, you come up with something to deal with hate speech. And the implicit threat, as Mitch said, was if you don't, then we're going to regulate. And so, of course, they came up with an agreement on how they were going to deal with hate speech. And that agreement would be probably unconstitutional in the United States, but in Europe they were able to, induce these platforms to adopt this as if it was kind of a Europe-wide law, but without the ability to challenge it before the European Court of Human Rights because it's not a law. So we are, I think, from my perspective, I'm definitely seeing more and more of these shadow regulations being prioritized over other measures. And so that's one of the reasons why we started this campaign this year. We would like to popularize the other, the positive agenda. So that's why I would like you all to take one of these or just look at it on our website. If you go to EFF.org/shadow, you can download this as a PDF. And if you're ever in a discussion about internet policy development where you think it's not being done in this way because it's not inclusive enough, it's not balanced enough, just point people to this and they can read a bit more about how we think it could be done better.
Just to add a shameless plug here, I should mention that EFF is like ISOC Bay Area is a nonprofit organization. We are supported in the main by donations from individuals. That's what supports our work and keeps us independent. We don't take government money, so donations appreciated. There are member benefits as well, as far as awesome swag, invitations to members-only events, and our weekly newsletter.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as an individual, it's very hard to know what is happening, maybe at the legal level of this type of activities and decisions that are happening, until it pertains to you, and sometimes you're not even aware of it until it's just way too late to get involved. So how would you advise us here to do that, like early involvement and understanding of this particular type of issues?
You're asking about early involvement and how to know what's coming down the pipe. Well, that's something EFF tries to do, and that we report on.
Even we find it difficult sometimes. Like sometimes a proposal will just come out of the blue, and sometimes it's almost too late for us to do anything about it. Particularly if it's happening. I'm from the international team of EFF, and because we're mainly US based, it's often difficult for us to act when there's a repressive internet law in some other country where we don't have a presence on the ground. But I think, just involving yourself in organizations like ISOC and EFF will help you to learn about these proposals as they're coming up. And often there are public consultations that you can be part of. There may just be petitions. There are many ways. We have a grassroots advocacy arm of EFF, the Electronic Frontier Alliance, which includes things like campus groups, and we don't actually have chapters in the way that ISOC does, but through the EFA we're trying to develop, I guess, something a bit like that, where people can get involved in their local communities to have a say in what's going on in their area.
I'm sure the other the various ISOC or regional chapters are a resource there as well.
So obviously the Electronic Frontier Foundation is advocating, not necessarily, you need regulations like hate speech on in Europe and so on, but I guess what do you foresee, and you also want to make, include people, I don't know, internet society or something else, but what do you see like the ideal scenario where you can have inclusion, not just obviously in the United States or North America, but worldwide? What do you see the best channel, and does the United Nations play into this at all?
Shall I attempt to do that? So the idea behind the Internet Governance Forum was to have a global internet discussion body that was anchored to the United Nations in a loose way. It's not a formal UN body in the same way that like the Security Council or UNESCO or WIPO are, but it's affiliated with the United Nations, and stakeholders can come together there to not make policies directly, but give their input that, in theory, will feed upwards into policy-making bodies elsewhere. This has been not quite as effective, in my opinion, as it should have been, because the IGF hasn't really effectively channeled the views of its participants into policy-making bodies, and it could do a lot more to improve that, such as making more concrete recommendations that can be taken up at the domestic level, or even in appropriate cases, maybe even in a treaty making body. For example, WIPO issued a treaty a couple of years ago for blind people called the Marrakesh Treaty, which requires countries to give a minimum level of protection to blind and vision impaired users, and to allow the transfer of vision of works that have been adapted for those users across borders. So that's an example where a treaty actually did do a good thing. But oftentimes treaties are completely wrong-headed because there aren't a diversity of views feeding into them. And the kind of thing that...
and they're often negotiated in secret, especially if they're styled as trade agreements.
The best example is the trade agreements, yeah.
Yeah.
So in the best case scenario, bodies like the IGF could be a way of gathering a broader cross-section of views from the community to feed into the development of international agreements and domestic laws alike. I don't think we're there yet, though. I think that's still kind of a vision of the future. And we have to be very careful about not allowing new global processes to sort of emerge behemoth-like and, you know, clobber internet users in the process. So we're cautious. I think as an organization, we're kind of cautious about global governance in general. But if we are going to go down that route, then I think definitely following these sort of criteria are the way we would like to see that done.
You know, just as the technical infrastructure of the internet draws a lot of its robustness from decentralization, I think there's value to having various sort of internet governance questions not all decided in the same forum, because that tends to avoid the problem of mission creep, which was essentially the danger that I was seeing at ICANN with respect to content regulation. I think sometimes bodies with a limited mission that are actually constrained to that limited mission do that better and don't do other things poorly.
So there's been a lot of criticism about how social media platforms have developed policies around online harassment and how users were included or not included. And so I think this goes back to your governance question of who is the body to kind of help lead that change. And I don't know if you had any kind of thoughts on that. It's kind of piggybacking off of your question on, which bodies are most appropriate to lead multi-stakeholder initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're asking about harassment policies or online harassment policies in the big internet content platforms. To apply our framework.
Yeah, we would probably start with the preamble, which says, do you need to have a coordinated policy on this? And maybe you don't. Maybe you just need to have Twitter doesn't need to coordinate with Facebook and do the same thing as Facebook and Microsoft and Google. Maybe this is just a case where the company should listen to its users and develop whatever policies are right for them.
But maybe in doing that, maybe they could apply some of these processes internally, or organize their user community in some way.
Maybe a follow-up to the follow-up. And this could be probably for Mark and Leah and you fellows as well as the board, I guess. I mean, Internet Society obviously is a multi-stakeholder. You saw the map there. They have chapters everywhere. It's worldwide. It's open. It's visible. It's inclusive. I hope it's balanced, and I hope it's accountable, right? So, I mean, how does the Internet Society and the Electronic Frontier Foundation perhaps collaborate even more in the future? Wouldn't that be something that, and I guess Leah and Mark should come in too as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. I'll repeat for the internet that he was asking about the possibility of a future collaboration between ISOC and ISOC chapters and EFF on some of these initiatives. We're happy to.
One of the things that EFF does do is, which we wouldn't describe as shadow regulation or wouldn't describe as an agreement at all, is to empower the individual users through technical tools like HTTPS everywhere and a privacy badger and certbot and these various other tools that we put into the hands of users to help them safeguard their privacy online and their freedom of expression online. So in that case, we're sort of EFF is having an impact on governance of the internet in a way, but it's not through a coordinated thing. It's more through empowering users at their level.
Just want to respond that we might need the mic for that.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say in response to your question, you know, these are huge, complex, complicated problems, and no one organization or no one group is going to accomplish it without working with others and working in partnership. And I think, you know, there's certainly on some files a natural fit between the work EFF does and the work the Internet Society does around the world. But again, these are big, complex issues, and I don't think it's a question of even EFF and ISOC working together. It's who else can we bring into that fold and build a strong internet community around these issues.
Yep, thank you, Mark. And just to follow up to Mark's comment, which I totally agree with. At the chapter level, we've just rolled out the working groups, and that is a channel for us to engage members on specific internet-related topics that they voice they are interested in.
And what working groups exist so far?
Yes, they exist all over, but we just created one for the chapter to find a way to involve our members in this region. So there are three main areas that our members expressed interest in. The first one was our working group for internet governance. So we're looking for a chair from our membership who will be leading that, and so we are rolling out that discussion now with our members. And then the second one was a working group for data protection and privacy and security, and that's pretty much exactly where EFF could tie in with that particular working group. So be able to get information going to the chapter and members who will be leading that particular working group, so that we get that information in a timely manner and be able to disseminate it very quickly and get more activity going on it. So that's one way where we as a chapter, we're very excited to be doing that. So I think that's a particular working group that would really be in concert with EFF and your efforts. The other working group is focused on Internet of Things and Internet technologies and access. So we welcome all our guests online and those physically here to go to our website, look that up, get involved, and email us because we are definitely getting that rolling, and we think it's a great way to get involved and address what Konstantin just asked. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Any more questions for anyone? Anybody?
Or Mark.
Mark, Leah, Mitch, Jeremy?
You can email either of us.
All right, great.
Okay, that was perfect timing. So yeah, all that's left for me to say now is thanks to everybody for showing up. Thanks to all of our speakers, Leah. Thanks to Mark for coming all the way down from Canada. Thanks to Jeremy and Mitch. Thanks to the other Jeremy at the back there who's been dutifully filming and taking pictures and still taking pictures.
I know, this is total, yeah. All right.
And Leah, do you want to say something? Or? Oh yeah, and if just please go and have a look at our website. Yeah, we've got all sorts of information on there about the working groups, about the vacant board positions, about volunteer positions. We're really trying to kind of make it into a more interactive news platform. So yeah, also let us know if anybody is organizing events that our members might be interested in. We're happy to advertise that. Yeah, that's about it, I think. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, well, on behalf of the San Francisco Bay Area ISA chapter, I sincerely want to thank all the members who responded to our invitation and be able to sign up and come and attend. And anybody else who joined via live stream too, we'd like to really thank you for that. We'd like again to thank ISA Global for donating funds to help us with this event, and sincerely thank Electronic Frontier Foundation for opening up their office as a location to host this event. And of course, Jeremy, coming from a ICANN conference, long trip. Mitch, sorry, Mitch. No, Mitch came from ICANN.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, yeah. He came farther away from, so he gets my, yes, yeah, absolutely. And Jeremy, for sharing the amazing work that you're doing here at EFF, and I look forward to collaborating with you much more extensively at a local level. And as stated earlier, we are regional, but with a global focus. So feel free to use us as a platform. It's your platform. We are all volunteers. The board members are volunteers. The members are volunteers. Everybody who work in the group, working group is volunteers. So we're not paid to do this. So we're doing it out of passion and interest for securing, an open and accessible internet. On that note, thank you very much. We will have networking and
one more thing.
Food and drinks after this. So feel free to stay behind and enjoy that.
And if you're not already a member, please consider joining. It's free.